Welcome back to this series on supply and demand, our third unit in our series on microeconomics. Today, what I'm going to discuss in this video is thinking about equilibrium from supply and demand and what happens when we are bringing supply and demand together. So thinking both about equilibrium and what that means, but also what it means to be out of equilibrium or disequilibrium. In general, a system being in equilibrium means that there is no tendency for change. The system that we are talking about here is transacted prices and quantities in a market. And what we're going to be doing is assuming that we have one market price, and the tendency for change that either is going to be there if we're not in equilibrium or is not going to be there if we are reaching equilibrium is coming from consumer and producer behavior. So what I want to emphasize, this is going to be one of my points of emphasis in this course, is that the definition for equilibrium is this no tendency for change. Now we're going to show that this happens in the market where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, but this isn't the definition of equilibrium. Quantity supplied equals quantity demanded is not what equilibrium means. It's that tendency to change. In baseball, winning happens when you score more runs than the opponent, but that's not what winning is. You can have winning in basketball, you can have winning in hockey, you can have winning in life, and all of these things have different contexts and different meanings, but just defining winning as scoring more runs misses that, and defining winning as equilibrium as quantity demanded equals quantity supplied misses this bigger picture of what equilibrium really is. So returning to this idea of this tendency to change, this disequilibrium, we're going to start there and move towards equilibrium. So given a current price, we can't be in equilibrium if at that current price consumers want to increase the amount that they're buying. They want to buy more at that price. Or if consumers want to buy less at that price. It has to be for consumers that they are buying the amount that they want to at that price. We're saying that the market price just happens. We're kind of moving that out and saying that's exogenous for now and looking at the consumer responses and the producer responses. The system also can't be in equilibrium if we're looking at sellers and producers, and at a given market price, they're willing to increase the amount that they sell. They're willing to sell more at that price than they are selling. We can't be in equilibrium. Furthermore, we can't be at equilibrium. There's a tendency to change if sellers want to decrease their amount at that market prices. So any of these four conditions are a tendency to change. There is a kind of reason to push us out of where we are, and any of those four result in a disequilibrium. So let's introduce some vocabulary that describes two main types of disequilibrium. The first type is a shortage. A shortage happens when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. That is, at that particular price, consumers want more than is available. Now, I want to emphasize that you can't talk about kind of a shortage without talking about prices. I'd love to have a Lamborghini. I would not love to have a Lamborghini at the kind of price it is because I really don't want to give up living because basically it would take every cent I am worth in order to afford that, right? And so that's not a shortage. It's just not willing to pay that price. And so when we're thinking about shortages, we must include prices in that. Right? So when we have the fact where quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, this tendency to change is going to show up in that consumers will outbid other consumers. They'll offer to pay more in order to not miss out on it. Right? They're willing to pay a little bit more if there's that excess quantity demanded. And therefore, suppliers are able to raise their prices without necessarily decreasing their sales. And so when we have a shortage, these incentives and these mechanisms lead to the tendency of prices to rise over time. So through supply and demand working together. Now, we'll be talking about an example with a housing market in class, and so to introduce a little bit of that, here we have supply and demand. And if the price was at 1,500, you can see that the quantity supplied of 5,000 is a lot less than the quantity demanded of 8,000. And so what you might see is people who are trying to get housing offering to pay a little bit more than 1,500. This is going to, because of this shortage of 3,000, it's going to put upward pressure on prices. And so this can't be the equilibrium. The other type of disequilibrium that I want to introduce is a surplus. A surplus is when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. In other words, firms have more goods than they're able to sell at that price. And what happens when we have a surplus is that no firm wants to get stuck with unsold inventory, so firms will lower their prices to attract other sellers and outbid the other sellers that way. Consumers who weren't previously buying will now start buying, and so with a surplus, there's a tendency for the price to fall over time. So illustrating a surplus, again, in that housing market example, if the price is at 3,000, quantity demanded, or sorry, 2,000, quantity demanded is going to be 4,000. Quantity supplied is going to be 3,000. And what we're seeing here is a surplus of 3,000. And so there's going to be downward pressure on prices as suppliers cut their rental rates in order to attract more buyers. Market equilibrium will happen when buyers and sellers are satisfied with their quantities at that market price. Jumping back to that tendency to change, it happens when we have none of this kind of desire to buy more or buy less by either party given that price. Right? And so graphically, this only can happen at one point. This graphically can only happen when supply and demand are equal, where they intersect. And so to define some terms here, that equilibrium price is the price that causes the quantity supplied to equal the quantity demanded. This is the price that clears the market. And equilibrium quantity is numerically that quantity that is corresponding to the equilibrium price. Now, the equilibrium quantity can be got from either the supply curve or the supply function or the demand curve or the demand function, because they should be giving you the same quantity. And that's a good way to check to make sure you're really getting a problem right, is once you have your equilibrium price to check in both equations that they're the same. The equilibrium point is that graphical intersection of supply and demand that corresponds to both the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now, we introduced this topic thinking about allocations and what markets are doing, and markets are essentially communicating information very effectively. They're communicating what value buyers place on that product, and that information is getting communicated from buyers to sellers through the mechanism of the market price, and we're also communicating from from sellers to buyers the cost of producing the product. This supply curve is capturing the cost. We'll get into this more when we get into supply, but the supply curve captures the producer's cost of production. The demand curve, which we'll get into more when we go deeper into demand, is capturing people's willingness to pay for a product. And when that willingness to pay equals that opportunity cost, that equilibrium is where the right amount of transactions are happening in terms of the benefits are equaling the cost. So that's equilibrium and disequilibrium, putting supply and demand together. Our last video in this unit is just going to kind of summarize some of the learnings that we've had so far. Hope you're hanging with me. Email me if you have questions, and I hope you're doing well. Take care.